Welcome back once again. This is part one of the history of child abuse and maltreatment. I think history is very important because in order to understand where we are today, we need a little bit of history. So you can listen to this multiple times if you like, because it is recorded for you. So the first slide, the future is sitting on top of the world. So as you realize, our children are our most important future. So some of the research causes poverty is the single best predictor of child abuse and neglect. And it's not that more poor people abuse and neglect their children. It's just that if you think of all the stressors that are brought on by poverty, if you think particularly this pandemic has shown us the stressors if you don't have enough food to eat, if you become unemployed, if you don't have childcare. So that's the context of it. Now, according to the Children's Defense Fund, the Children's Defense Fund is a great website that has lots of different information and issues. And so I encourage you to go in there and explore it. And parental substance abuse and addiction is also a high predictor of child abuse and neglect. Obviously, if parents are putting their efforts into substance abuse, it's hard for them to be able to care for their children. So a little bit more research. More than 80% of the victims were abused by at least one parent. Now, statistics change, and I'm talking about child abuse and maltreatment situated in the United States. All right, and statistics come and go. So this is roughly an average. And 13.4% were abused by non-parental perpetrators. So when we talk about stranger danger, it's not always strangers. Okay, the majority of the time, as we can see, it is really parental figures, whether that be a kinship person or a grandmother or something like that, whoever is the particular parent. So children, as we know briefly, they were thought of as property. Okay, they were good for labor, property of families, and usually the fathers, because way back when 1500s, 16, 17, 1800s, they were the father was thought of as the head of the household, and the killing of children, infanticide, was prevalent, especially if the children born were females, because females were not thought of as valuable as males. And if you compare it to today, you see that females still earn less for the same job that they do as males. I think it's like something like they earn like maybe 85 cents to the male's dollar. Not exactly sure that figure, but it's something like that. It's gotten a little better, but many times it's not comparable. Some of you that took this social work class may recall this. The Elizabethan Poor Law. When you look at today's traditional Department of Social Service welfare system, it came really from when we were governed by England. And it was known as the Elizabethan Poor Law. So the poor were separated into two categories. If you were able-bodied and capable of working, you got a little bit of aid. Okay? If you were old or disabled, you got a little more, and obviously dependent children got the most. They got the most aid. So our system today is means tested. And that means when you apply for benefits, you still have to fit into a category. So if you're, for example, if you're applying for TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, and your income is only 10 cents over 20 cents, you get denied that. Some of you may have experience with this personally, or some of you may know others who have experience with this personally. A bit of good news, though, is the food stamps. Now, they decided that it was based on what we call the Thrifty Food Plan that was developed back into the 30s and 40s. The last time it was revised was then, and it was based on what a family of 3 needs to live. But if you think about it, in those decades, what was missing? Cell phones, computers, and those 2 items can be very costly. Child care. Back then, the children were cared for by the family. So the good news is that they have upped the monthly amount that individuals can receive. So it takes a lot to revise laws. The service learning focus of this is advocacy. So when you think about advocacy, that moves pretty slow, not to be revised since the 20s or 30s when the Thrifty Food Plan was first created. And child labor was very common. Indentured parents apprenticed their children to masters who taught them a trade so that they can earn money. Okay, children were thought of back then as mini adults. So Industrial Revolution, when we did lots of work by machines, children were thought of as cheap labor. And a woman named Jane Addams, which you will read about in your book, so I'll just briefly describe that, Hull House, she kind of realized that this wasn't a good thing for children and started caring for some children at Hull House. And so a little bit of recent history. The 17th and 18th centuries, they started to have voluntary child welfare services. In other words, what people get paid for today, back in the 17th and 18th centuries, was voluntary. And when you think about how laws change, advocacy. 1868, physicians advocated for the protection of children due to a misdiagnosis by Dr. Athol Johnson, which again you will read about in your book, but he misdiagnosed a child, and it was really a case of child abuse. So that led other physicians to look more carefully at children. So you think about how laws change. One on the website, there's a tab. It's called Kira's Law. This little girl, Kira, was killed over 10 years ago with visitation by her father. They were separated, and the mother kept saying he was a domestic abuser. And for some reason, they still allowed the visit with the father. And so the father killed the child. So the mother started advocating for Kira's Law. My class actually wrote their letters about Kira's Law, so that could be a choice too for you. Unfortunately, it did not pass legislation. What the governor did, however, is he convened a task force to look at all those custody issues. So, I said, oh, that's not really enough. But when you think of advocacy and how laws change, unfortunately, it takes a long time. In my opinion, 10 years is too long. So that's why we need to keep advocating for this to keep children safe. So more history. 1874, Henry Bergh was the first president for the Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals. Why is this important? This is important because the Society for the Protection for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals, that was founded before the child abuse protection laws and the state central registry for children. So if you think about why we still need to advocate for children's issues and laws, because children have a history of being just property and not being very important. And then the next year, a year later, was the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. 1909, the White House Conference on Dependent Children supported a plan for a children's bureau. So again, this is an evolution of how we can support children's issues, okay? And somebody had to start that. It had to be somebody's idea. So you never know. You could be the one to think of some really, really great idea for children. And again, a lot of times things are born out of, issues are born out of tragedy. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Ecstasy's law. Ecstasy was a little girl in Schenectady County, and the motel manager, the little girl was being abused by her mother's boyfriend, and so the manager of the hotel where they were called the Department of Social Services, but he got a recording, and the boyfriend eventually threw bleach in Ecstasy's eyes. Now, fortunately, she ended up being okay, but that resulted in called Ecstasy's laws. So now everyone who works for the Department of Social Services is a mandated reporter. So if they get a call like that, if you call any division in the Schenectady Department of Social Services, you will see a recording. If this is suspected child abuse and maltreatment, you will get the New York State hotline so that you have a referral of somebody to call. And everybody in New York State is trained. Department of Social Services has to do mandatory child abuse and maltreatment training and is a mandated reporter. So 1930, again, the Social Security Act, that mandated child welfare services for neglected, dependent children in danger of becoming delinquent, okay? That should be in danger instead of danger, of becoming delinquent. In other words, running away. So, money was a big issue. And if you remember, in 1929, the stock market crashed. So it was even more of an issue then. 1962, Dr. C. Henry Kemp discovered the term the battered child syndrome, a clinical condition in young children who have received severe physical abuse, and sometimes we think of labeling as bad, but if there's truth to it, it often isn't, because it results in money, and it results in realizing that many more children were being abused and neglected. And again, the laws over time have changed of what constitutes abuse and neglect. And we'll get into that in other lectures. So further efforts, 1972 and 73, the National Center for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect was started. Now, if you think about that, I know many of you, some of you were not born in 72 or 73, but think about how long that took to be able to, have some more coordinated services for children. So it provided money to have the research and establishment of a clearinghouse for child abuse and neglect, and create materials and to be able to distribute materials. There were demonstration projects to see what actually helped to reduce child abuse and neglect. For example, the Schenectady Community Action Program, SCAP, has a very extensive home visitation program where they hire home visitors, social workers, to go into the homes to help parents and caregivers maybe deal with some of their issues. So prevention activities and projects are very important. Now, again, there is not enough of those. We are not, in my opinion, a real preventative society. And then we had to study the effectiveness of child abuse and neglect reporting laws to see how they have to be revised. And you will see in the next part is they have been revised. And the last slide in this part, then there's another part, is more efforts, the proper role of the federal government in assisting state and local efforts. That was being defined. In other words, what was the responsibility of the federal government? How much money would they give to the states? What would they provide to the particular states? And the states were required to adopt specific procedures to identify, treat, and prevent child abuse. So the long and the short of it is it kept being more standardized. So, you know, when you standardize something, it kind of levels the playing field for children. So they were trying to figure out what was the role of the federal government, what was the role of the state government, what was the role of the local government. Okay, now that may sound familiar if some of you are listening to the news, and how do they all work together? Okay, so this is part 1. Part 2 will be continued.